Welcome to week 8, day 34 of the spring 2025 Web Technologies course. This is Jim Kaufman with Rankin Technical College. So first, I just wanted to start out with an announcement as far as a job fair. So there's going to be a job fair in St. Louis on, downtown St. Louis on March the 5th. Starts at 9 a.m., 9 to 11 a.m. So that's down on Finney Avenue in St. Louis. So, there's also one in Wentzville on the March the 6th, but Wentzville really doesn't have a lot of IT related. And so for the St. Louis job fair, actually, this job fair is actually, I think it's two different departments. I think it's the IT division and electric division that they're not really associated with any, with each other, but they're having a job fair for those two different divisions, the IT division and the electrical division. So, but I think there's about 13. I heard about 13. Maybe there'll be a few more than that. So 13 different companies that'll be there. And if, I know it's early, for many of you in this course. This is either your first course or your second course, so maybe you're not quite ready to look for a job or that. But but still can be beneficial to check it out. So just let me know if you're. I'd kind of like to know if you are going to be going. I am planning on going down there on March the 5th, St. Louis, downtown St. Louis for that. And as well, I will be out there at the Wentzville one on March 6th. And you're fine, it's fine if you want to come out to that as well. But I just kind of want to let you know that there's really not a lot for IT out there. It's really for more of the other programs, just the way it is. And like I said, it's not that you have to attend, and there'll be other opportunities to go as well. But if if it's something you're interested in, you want to check it out, just let me know if you're thinking about possibly attending. So let's go ahead and walk through. So today we're going to I'll walk through the HOT, where there isn't much really to walk through on that. And actually all the assignments are pretty straightforward, but I'll walk through the HOT, and then we'll do a Chapter 4 lecture and demonstration, and then we'll go ahead and walk through the Chapter 4 assignments, which are pretty straightforward as well. So as far as the hands-on test is concerned, so first, obviously, you see right here says test. This really should be hands-on test. So actually, all these assignments for Chapter 4 and 5 are all PDFs. Usually I have those links for each assignment, and they're usually on Google Cloud. But some of these other assignments were created out here, and they're as PDFs. So just to let you know that. But so here on test, this is basically should be your hands-on test folder, your JavaScript, directory, hands-on test, and then the HOT, which is JS HOT 1. And then obviously it says, use only your textbooks. You can't use any other resources, but that's one of the advantages of being an online student. It's a little different for you guys. So, but as far as these assignments, I think they're pretty straightforward here. These different challenges, there's 4 of them, 5 of them. I will give you one hint. Both challenge 4 and 5, creating these odd numbers. Think of just a hint. Think of remainders. Think of remainders when you're doing this. So how do you determine about a remainder? That might help you. I don't want to tell you the exact thing to use, but think about how you would display something with using a remainder, right? Not much here to really go over. I think it's pretty straightforward. So let me know if you have any questions about anything in here, but I don't think this should be too bad for anyone. So if you've did the other assignments, you should be good with this as well. All right, so next we'll go ahead and get into this chapter. All right, so So this chapter is, got multiple things going on in this chapter. We're going to talk about JavaScript objects, functions, and events. So for JavaScript, there's these called the host events, and it's in the browser environment. So there's certain host events that are available to you, and it's the window is the the global one. This is the global object for JavaScript. Represents the open browser window, right? And then you have a document which represents the HTML document in the browser window. It allows you to work with a document object model, which is called the DOM. Okay. Then there's also navigator and history. So these are other objects that are available within that within the browser environment that you have access to. And let me show you real quick on that. Let's see, I got this set up. So basically here, I'm just going to come down here. And I'm sure I've already done this, but there's a window object, right? If I put window in there and click, and check that out, you're going to see that there's all these different properties, methods, etc. You don't need to know all of these, but as you go on, there'll be some ones that they're going to look familiar, right? Alert, you've done an alert already, so you've seen an alert before, and there'll be other ones here. I don't think you've done a confirm yet, but confirm will be one, and there's other ones here as well that you'll learn to use. You don't need to know all of these, but just letting you know that there is a window object with lots of different options that are available to use. And then also you have the document. So you kind of look at the as far as a document is concerned. I guess one thing I want to kind of really explain. So when the browser parses what a browser does when you call a web page, when it brings that web page, it's actually going to parse that HTML. So that file of HTML, like what we've been creating, the browser is going to parse that and create a DOM object from it. Okay, so for the HTML here on the left-hand side, which there's not much here. But what it's going to do, it's going to go ahead and parse that into a document, right? And so here's basically your document object model, okay? And what we're going to see this a little bit today, and actually a lot more going forward. Chapter 6 probably really more, which would be next week. We do more on the DOM, but with JavaScript, you can change things in the DOM, right? That don't reflect in your file, right? The DOM, which is in the browser here, is in memory, right? It's in memory. The DOM's in the memory, where this is just a static file, right? So you can do all kinds of things using JavaScript and interacting with that DOM, create new fields in there, new input tags, new tables, all kinds of different things. Any kind of HTML element, you can change CSS colors, fonts, all that with using JavaScript, right? And that will never be reflected in your file. It's only reflected in memory within the document object model. Okay, hope that kind of makes sense. As time goes on, it'll make more sense if it doesn't now. So. Okay, so, and then like we said, there's also navigator and history. So here's some of the JavaScript native objects. So object is the base object that all other JavaScript objects inherit from. Okay, array is an object that stores collections of data. Date obviously stores a date. And then you have a function is an object that stores a predefined collection of JavaScript statements. A number Okay, so there's also, we looked at primitives before, right? Where we had a string primitive, and it's basically when you're just defining a variable and you put that in quotation marks. When you put that in quotation marks, that is a string literal, right? And that is a string primitive, that's considered a string primitive. Same as if you defined a variable and you gave it the number 5, that's another primitive, right? But there's also these wrapper objects, and here these three here: a number wrapper object, a string wrapper object, and a Boolean wrapper object. Okay, and what you can do with that is there's certain functions that are available, which we've already kind of done. You've already seen that a little bit. Maybe like when we do a to fixed or a to uppercase on something. That actually, even though you don't realize it, but under the hood, so to speak, it's actually using a wrapper to do that. Okay, let's kind of look at that a little bit here. So first, just real quick here, before we really start with the wrapper, I do want to go over this a little bit. Hold on, I'm sorry. So here, we've got two strings here, str and str2, right? They both have hello world, okay? They both have hello world. And so we're asking, is this string equal to this string, okay? And if we go over here on the left-hand side, this is const on row 9. This is true, right? Makes sense, right? So obviously, if you change this to another value, right? I mean, nothing surprising. It's going to be false, right? All right. So we're going back to true here. But I wanted to kind of mention one thing about this is there's also this idea of the wrapper. So here's this new string, and you're creating just a string called hello and hello. So you've got two different objects. So you're kind of say, are these equal to each other? And this is what on line 20 here. So over here, these are false. So what happens here is a little different. And this is a wrapper, right? This is one of the wrapper classes. Well, I shouldn't say that because this is actually a wrapper object. Okay. Not to confuse things. But I'm going to back up here. Let's hold off on this just for a minute. I'm sorry, I'm probably confused you on that. Let's come into here, this line. And so here you're taking a string, which you defined here, the string, and you do it a dot length. Well, primitives don't have, and since there's no open and close parentheses on dot length, that means this is a property, right? This is a property. And so primitives don't have a property. But in JavaScript, you can actually do this because what happens is under the hood, so to speak, right? In the background, the JavaScript engine is actually creating a wrapper class. It's actually using this wrapper class, right? It's actually using a string wrapper class to create an object out of this so it can invoke this property on that, okay? So that's important just to kind of understand that basically primitives don't have properties or methods associated with them. And whenever you see something like this, whenever you're doing something with a primitive and you got a dot something, anytime you got a dot after a primitive, then you're actually, what's happening under the hood, it's invoking a wrapper. And in this case, it's a string wrapper. And it's using the dot length of the string wrapper to get the length of the string, okay? And then so now we're back down here. Sorry about that. But so here we're creating a string a different way. We're using a string object to create a string, okay? And in this case, since you got string object and string object 2, and we went to see if they're equal to each other, it says false. And the reason for that is because whenever you create an object has a unique memory location. So it actually is in a, what you're doing is saying, is this object the same as this object? No, it's not, because they're distinct objects. So they're not equal to each other. Now the value that's in that object, yes, they are, but this object itself, no, it's not equal to each other, okay? And I'm going to show you a little bit more on that as well here. Not that it's really important for the test or anything, but I do want to kind of go through a couple things here. So, like we said, so here's that string str and str2, right? The string we're talking about. So how this works with memory, and this is that, you know, you don't need to know this, but I'll tell you, if you can kind of ever, when you're in an interview sometime and you're answering questions, if you can kind of work this in to something you're talking about, you know, it'll show that you really know some things that usually this is not entry level stuff. It's really kind of a little bit above that. But basically for strings are stored in a stack. Primitives are stored in a stack, okay? And for a string though, that string is going to point to what's called a string pool, and that's in the heap. There's a stack and a heap, okay? And in that string pool, what happens is when you create a variable, in this case str, it's going to point to the string literal, which you have as hello world, right? And what happens is, the way the JavaScript engine works is, if you create another variable and you give it the same name, if it's the same exact one, okay, if it's the same exact one, it will actually point to that same one in memory, okay? If it's the same exact one, it's going to point to that same thing in memory. So that's kind of why that makes this equal to this, because it's actually pointing to the same thing in memory. Now, obviously, if you change the value of either one, then that will, you know, not be the case anymore, right? It'll point to its own. It'll be in here another time, right? A different value. But as far as primitives, as far as string primitives use what's called a string pool that's in the heap. All your variables are in the stack, okay? String pools are in the heap, and also objects are stored in the heap. But, you know, the important thing I'm just trying to make right now is just to understand that when you define a string, okay, you're going to have a string literal, and if you define another variable, with the same name, right, the same value, it's going to point to the same string literal, okay? Whereas if I just go down here a little bit, so for an int, it's a little different. Integers, you know, this is a number, right? This is a number with, you know, the integer number 100, but it's a number. So for numbers don't have a number pool or anything like that. So the numbers are just pointing to this, right? But for numbers, it's just done a little differently. If, you know, basically it's going to go by value. Does this value equal this value? If it's true, that's fine, okay? It'll be equal. But integers don't have that, right? So all primitives are basically stored kind of in the stack. So we've seen the numbers, the big int, things like that are always going to be stored in the stack, right? But when you've got objects are stored in a heap. And when you got string pools, when you use the strings, the string will be stored in a string pool, which will also be in the heap, okay? So just to get back to this, so we've seen how these two can be equal to each other, right? If they're the same value. And here, this is how it's different. For a string object, you're creating a new string object, right? And you can see this has an address location, and this has an address location, right? This is just kind of made up, right? But this is kind of how it works under the hood. So actually, this address is different than this address. So when you say, is string object equal to string object 2, it's going to be false because they're pointing to different addresses. These are stored in a different spot, okay, in memory. But, you know, sometime, you know, later on, maybe towards you get close to time when you're going to go to some interviews and stuff, it's kind of a good idea. At least be able to understand some of these concepts, how things are stored. Because, if you can weave that in when you're answering some interview question, it can be very helpful to show, wow, you know something here about that, right? So it can be beneficial for you. Let's get back to the. All right. Where were we on all of this? So yeah, we've seen how this is not equal to each other, and the same thing for a Boolean, right? So obviously a Boolean, let's see, this is on line 25. I go over here on the JavaScript. Line 25 is false, obviously, because one's true, one's false. But even if you make these both true, right? Same concept. And that's line 25, which is right here. Even though they're both true, it's false because this is a different this is in a different, I shouldn't say this variable is actually stored on the stack. And the heap is where the object is stored, right? That was in the heap, the object. And this is going to have a different address location than this one. So these will never be equal to each other, okay? Now, obviously, if you do, like this, right? If we change this to like this, right? Now it's true. It's because how those objects are stored and how primitives are stored. And for here, this Boolean is going to be the same thing when we looked at that integer, right? We looked at that number, which is right here. It would work the same way as this one. Boolean 1, Boolean 2 would be here, and they would be equal to each other, right? Because they're not going to have a separate address location, right? So, all right. I think, and once again, so we were kind of looking at coming in here talking about wrappers. So once again here, as far as wrapper classes, remember that under the hood, whenever you've got a primitive and you've got a like a dot property or you're calling a method on a primitive, realize that under the hood, so to speak, that the JavaScript engine is creating a wrapper, and it's actually a temporary wrapper. It's a temporary wrapper that's a temporary wrapper object. It's being used to perform the operation, okay, and then it's setting this variable with the result of that, okay, setting that variable with the result of that, okay. It doesn't make this a object, right? It's actually just under the hood. It's using a wrapper object to perform the task, so to speak. And then once it's done, it's going to assign the value of that to what's on the left-hand side here. All right. So some of the native objects, okay. So this is a situation right here where we're looking at I think it's a little bigger. Same concept here is a to fixed, right? So pi is a constant here, which is a float, just a number, right? Basically a floating point, but it's assigned, pi is assigned to a number. And then you take that number, which this right here is the integer, right? I mean, this is the primitive number, and it's doing a to fix. So what happens, the JavaScript under the hood is taking this and wrapping this in a wrapper object, a number wrapper object, so it can call the to fix method that belongs to the wrapper object. Or I shouldn't say the to fix method that belongs to the number object. All right. So terms related to objects, I've got a little more about that here. So in JavaScript, an object is a collection of key value pairs. And that's kind of different. We were talking about the window object and that, but you also have user created ones as well. But so you can think of an object in JavaScript as a container that holds data, properties, and functions, methods related to a specific entity. For example, a car object might have properties like color, make, model, and methods like start, engine, and drive. Okay. Now we'll talk about functions here in a little bit. Functions can be, when we talk about methods, when we talk about objects, when a function is belongs to a when a function belongs to an object, it's really called a method, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But because function and we're going to talk about functions as well here, different kinds of functions. But functions can, exist on their own without an object, right? They can exist in a file by themselves without an object. And then we're just they're basically called functions. But if you have a function that's associated with a certain method, with a certain object, then it's considered a method, okay? And we'll talk about that again here in a bit. So then a property is a characteristic or an attribute. Just like we set up here, color would be a color, engine size, any kind of property about that object, right? A method is a function that is associated with an object. It defines the behavior of the object. In the car example, start engine would be a method. It's a function that can be called on the car object to perform an action. You also have what's called a host object. Host objects are objects provided by the environment in which the JavaScript code is running. They are not part of the core JavaScript language itself. For example, a browser, the window, and the document objects are host objects. Okay, window and document are host objects. Native objects, also called built-in objects, are objects that are part of the JavaScript language itself, right? So these include object, array, string, number, date, math. Okay, you can use these objects directly in your code without needing to create them. So some objects, are user created, and some objects exist already, right? Native objects are within the JavaScript language. Host objects are within the browser environment, okay, or other environment as well. Because also there's a framework called Node that we spoke briefly about before. Node's a runtime environment, but it's not a browser, right? And it also has host objects as well. And then the web browser, for example, with Chrome has host objects, right? And then also there's utility objects. Wrapper object, we already talked about the wrapper objects. And that wraps, when you use a primitive, like a string or number, as if it were an object, JavaScript temporarily creates a wrapper around that primitive. So when you call, like here, saying hello to uppercase, JavaScript creates a string wrapper object to access the to uppercase method. And these wrapper objects are automatically discarded after the operation. Okay, it's just a temporary thing. A utility object, while not a formal JavaScript term, yes, this is generally refers to objects that provide helper functions or constants for a common task. A math object is a good example. It has methods like math random and constants like math pi. So we've seen how we actually created a constant called pi before, but that's actually already available in the math.pi, right? You can use that, and that's a utility function. You might also create your own utility objects. Yeah, so you can always create your own utility objects that you can use as well. You'd call, maybe you put that in a separate file. You can call in that file and do the same thing like you do math.py. Here you could have your own object that you created, the name of that object, and whatever property or method that's on that object, right? Okay. So here's a method of the window object. Like here, this is a confirm. And you're just asking if you want to delete this item, and then based on OK or cancel, if confirm delete, if this is true, then you're going to execute this code. So if somebody hit OK, OK is going to return true, cancel is going to return false. If you hit OK, it's going to execute this code down here, right? But the fact of this being a window object, as you can see, in your code, you can just say confirm, right? If you can, you could actually do window.confirm because that's valid as well, but you don't have to because it's a window object and you don't have to, right? But this would be considered a method of the host object, where you talked about the host objects, and the Windows a host object in a browser. So confirm is a method of the host object window. All right. Here's two methods of window object for working with numbers. So yes, parse int and parse float. So really a lot of times, and I think I mentioned this last week. So if you ever see anything in code and it doesn't have, it's not defined in that code or defined somewhere else, like you could be calling in a separate JavaScript file. It's an object that belongs to the window, right? If you just see parse int, you can tell that this belongs to window unless you define this yourself or you call in a different JavaScript file that determines that. So everything that starts with this are going to be window methods, right? And they're going to belong to that window object. So in this case, it's just showing you can parse int or parse float and what your values will be. If you parse int, it's going to go ahead and cut off everything at the decimal point after, right? It's just going to truncate it, right? And here for this parse float, it's just going to return the whole value. Now, if you do a toFixed, let's see, does this go do a toFixed? If you do a toFixed, it will round it. So if you do a toFixed, let's just say you did a toFixed on the .67, it's going to round it up to 68 because this is 5 or greater, right? This third one here. Here's 3 methods of that. Okay, let's go back and look at some code here. All right. And so there's also this type of. So here we got on line 30 is string, which we've got up here defined. String is just a primitive string, and string 2 is a primitive. And then we have string object, which is an object. You can do a type of on that to see what it is. Okay. There might be sometimes you want to test to see what some object is. And, in this case, it's pretty simple and straightforward. But sometimes when you're using other libraries and different things, there might be a reason that you want to see what kind of object it is. Okay. You might want to perform different things depending on what kind of object it is. So here, 31. So on the right-hand side in the console, you can see the first one is an type of a string, and the second one here is an object on line 31. Here's type of test. So here, type of test 2, which is 39, is a string, all right? Is a string. And if we make this a 1 instead, that is line 39 as well here. And now it's going to say number for that one, right? Makes sense, number and string. Okay, then there's also it's called a query selector. And it's going to basically, so when you, just like what we did in C# in cascading style sheets, the pound sign is for a ID. So if we go ahead and look over here, we've got an ID of email address, right? We have an email address. And so this is getting that field, okay? And this is a query called the query selector. And then you can do document query selector, this. That's the same, you know, and the query selector opens it up because you can get more things. You know, we'll see that in a minute. You don't necessarily have to just get an ID. In this case, you're getting an ID, right? But you can also get a class where you can get different things. Don't always have to be an ID. Whereas the other one we looked at was .get element by ID. That's only going to work for IDs only, right? But a query selector is a little more broader. It can work for different types of elements. You can get different kinds of elements. It depends on how you prefix it and how you use it. In this case, since you have a pound, that means it's an ID. So you're getting the ID of the element with the ID of email address, which is right there. In this case, you're getting the value of that. So we'll go look at that, which is a string. I think because I've got a placeholder in there. It's because I got a placeholder in there, huh? That's interesting, yeah. Because it's text. All right. I regressed on that one. Okay, parse int converts a string to an integer. And so once again, this is a parse int is a, well, it's defined here as a function, but this belongs to the number to the window object, right? Because you got a parse int, you're not prefixing this or anything, so you know this belongs to the window object, right? Pretty much straightforward on that. And so here, once again, it's going to truncate, right? It's going to truncate your decimal place, right? Decimal place and everything after that decimal place. So the value would be 461. And then just kind of skip the date thing for a minute. So here's one where you're doing a toFixed. You're parsing the float and you're doing a toFixed on it. And so on this one here for toFixed, it's basically you're only going to want, you know, you're only going to want the two decimal places after 2 decimal places, right? So it's going to take this and it's going to round it up or down, right? Let's see here. Maybe I have this wrong here. Which one is this? That's number 5. Yeah, it's just because this is saying it the wrong way. So yeah, if I make this a 5 or greater, so it did, you know, it's rounded that correctly. If I make that a, so, and now, for that line 5, what are we at now? Then so it's going to round it up, right? It's going to round it up or down, right? Doesn't truncate anything. Okay, and then here's a way to create a new date. So here we got a birthday. Birthday equals a new date. We're given passing a string parameter the date, right? And it will print that out. And so maybe make this a little bigger, bring this over a little bit. So here's your string. It's going to convert that. It's going to convert that into this format. So this is going to be the format. This is going to be the format of to-date string. The day of the week, the month, day of the week, the month, the day, and the year. That one's a different one. So same thing though. So you got the day of the week, the month, the day, and the year. And you can grab the year, you can grab the month, and you can grab the dates just by using these methods. And these methods belong to what? They belong to the date object, right? These are methods. Get full year, get month, get date. These all belong to the get date object. All right. So real quick. So we already looked at grabbing the email address, which that was by ID. Doing the same thing here. And you're grabbing the rate, which is another ID. Down here, this other one here, you are actually, you can notice this is a little different. This is query select all. This is grabbing all of the images. Okay, it's grabbing all of the images. So over here on the right, on the browser, the far right over there, you've got 3 different placeholder images, right? So this is actually going to, if we just take this and grab this and go down here, our thing, as you can see, it says node list 3, image, 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 right? So the query select all will return a node list of 3 images, okay? Basically a list, just think of it a list of three images. Get the text box using the value property. Oh yeah, so just something to make sure you don't make a mistake. And actually, I think when I did the last week when I was walking through the exercise, chapter 2 exercise, I forgot to do dot value, right? Wondering what's not going on. What's going on here? It's not working. So here in this case, up here, back here, this number 7 one. So when you do this document.query selector rate like this. This is always getting the object itself, the element, okay, the element object, right? So I put that down here. So rate text is the complete element, right? This is basically your text box. It's going to return the whole text box. If you want the value, right, then you need to do dot value, right? And in this case, it's empty, but that's how you get the value of something. So, just always remember that, and then also you could do, so in this case, what are we doing? In this case, since I put dot value at the end, right? I put dot value at the end, this is now the value, right? So different way, 2 different ways you can do this here, right? You can either get the input field. It depends on your needs, right? But in this case, I could change this to dot value. That'll just get the value. If I want the whole input field, I can get the whole input field that way, right? Now, what this is doing here is just using a query selector. It's grabbing the rate and it's putting focus into that field. So let's see. Hopefully this is going to be working, right? I'll just make this bigger. Oh well. So if I just refresh the screen, you can see that this whole box got highlighted. I know this is kind of small. You probably can barely see this, but you know, you do got the cursor in there, right? So, and this can come in handy sometimes when you might have something where you enter some data and you want to, after you do that, you want to put focus in a different field than the normal tab order type thing. You may want to, once they enter something, it may go into a different field, and so you want to put focus in a different field, and that's how you use that dot focus to make that happen. All right. And here's just creating a new date. We kind of already did that. All right, let's go back, see what's here on this. So we looked at query selector. We look at query selector all. So query selector will work for different things, for IDs, for other things as well. For class names. Query selector all will get all of the different. Actually, for a class name, you probably want to do query selector all because you probably have multiple, right? Things with a class name. But query selector all will get you all. And in this case, we had showed you had 3 different images. It'll get all 3 images, and it's going to put that in a list. Okay. So basically here, what we're just seeing, here's a rate. Basically, by using the pound sign, it's getting it by ID. Using the element type query selector. Oh yeah, it was showing, yeah. Let me see, I don't know. I think this slide got messed up at some point, but returns an array of objects. This is a query selector all. So like if you have multiple links, you have multiple A links, right? You do query selector all, it'll get all of those, right? So you could do all divs, right? You want to select all your divs. You want to select, any kind of element on a table. You put, on a table. Any kind of element on your page, if you put that in here, it's going to return all. It's going to put it in a list just like it did the images when we looked at that example. It's going to be a whole list of all those elements that, whatever you put in there. Now, if you want like I was saying, if you want if you want to do a class that you have defined on your elements, then you need to really use select all and use a dot instead of the pound sign, right? Use a dot. So that will return all of the, every element. So that could be different. It could be, you could have one div, one P, one span, and if all of them had dot error, it would return all 3 of those, even though they're different element types, right? So it's just going to match on the class, okay? But you want to make sure that you do query selector all for those, even if there's only one, because basically, if you want them all, then that's the only way you're going to be able to get them all. You have to do them all. You have to do query selector all on that. So here's a way you can do what's called a descendant selector. Similar to kind of what we did with cascading style sheets. And so this is going to return an array of all HTML elements that are descendants of the element whose ID is FAQs, right? So here's your frequently asked questions, and this is basically an ID. So it's going to look for that ID, and if it's got multiple H2 it has multiple H2 tags, it's going to grab those. Obviously, probably you don't really want to do that like that. Semantically, you probably want to. That's probably not always best, but that's okay. But whatever tag you have here, if you had other divs under there, or multiple span tags, multiple paragraph tags, you could just also put that in there as well. Then here, combinations selector. returns an array of all div elements assigned to the closed class, right? So, yep. So if you got 20 divs and you got 3 of them that are use the closed class, then it's going to bring back those 3 that are using the closed class that are also divs. Then here's using multiple selectors. This is going to return all the H2 tags that are descendants of the FAQs, which would be the ID of FAQs, and then it's returning all the any P that's also associated with a div, right? So this would be returning H2s and P tags. Obviously, H2 that's only associated with this. It has a parent of FAQs here, and this is going to return all P tags that are under any div. I know we've already did this on exercise, but basically this is how you write a line of HTML into a document by using the document.write. So obviously you can tell just by looking at your write method here that this write method belongs to what object? It belongs to the document object, right? It doesn't belong to the Windows object. If it belonged to the Windows object, you wouldn't need to even prefix it. But anything, this document.write, there's not a lot of different document ones that you probably have to worry about too much. But, document.write's a very popular one to be using. And so you to be able to use it, you have to make sure you prefix it with document. So here's methods, properties of a text box object, focus and select. So text box, you can do a focus or you can do a select. And also has 2 properties. You can have a value or disabled. Okay, let's go take a look at that. One method for the number is just telling you to fixed. Let's just kind of give you an examples. Let's look at the code here a little bit. So we looked at that. So disabled. So what we're doing here is amount element. Do I have this defined up here? No. So I have this amount element up here that's basically getting the amount field, which let's just go look at that. Here's this an amount field. It has a value of 200, right? Okay, so you got that amount field. And then down here, we're doing amount field dot disabled equals true. So if we look at the amount field here, you can see it's got this grayish background, so it's disabled. You can't click in here. You can't change it, right? So that's how you can add that. So that's the same thing as basically, you've learned when we were doing when we were doing the HTML stuff, we just can do disabled, right? You can do this, right? And that's basically what it's doing. It's actually doing that, even though you're not going to see it being reflected in the actual static HTML. That's what it's doing in the document object model, right? Actually, I do want to look at something here. Real quick here, I'm going to see something. So as you can see, like we're talking about the amount. So even though over here, let's save this. So we don't have disabled over here, all right? We only have it in our JavaScript where we did disabled here, right? So here we don't have disabled. I just want to refresh this to make sure that this is, sometimes it don't always refresh. So for our document, so this is basically our DOM object, right? We go look in here. as you can see, even though it's not on in our static HTML file, since we're using the document, JavaScript is actually using the document object model. That's what it uses. It changes. It doesn't change the static file. It changes that document object model. And in this case, you're changing the element, right? You're changing the amount element, the input type, this text element, right, of ID amount to add disabled, right? Let's see here, what's next? All right, let's talk about functions now. All right, let's take a look at this real quick. How the value property get the value. Kind of already did that. And basically do it as part of one statement. If you need to just get, all you care about is getting the value, then you can just do dot get value after your query selector, after your end parentheses. You can dot value to get the value. And then obviously up here, this first one here, this is going to return that whole input text, right? We've seen that already. This is parse float. So here it's just reassigning values. How to use a parse float max to get a number. So basically just reassigning values over and over here. So you've got your sales amount. So this is your whole text box, right? That whole text box. And then you're reassigning that to the value of, the value that's in that text box. Now that's the value. Now you're reassigning the same variable equal to parse float of this value. So it kind of, what word do I want to use here? You're changing this as you go down here, kind of a hierarchy thing here. So this is this is equal to the whole input text. Then this is only equal to the value. And then this is equal to what's sent back after you call the parse float on that value, right? The result of the parse float, right? And here it's just showing chaining. Instead of doing it this way, you can do it all in one. You can parse float of the query selector with the dot value at the end, right? So this is chaining, just a little shorter, much easier way to do it. And here's just another example of chaining as well. So here is, how to create a JavaScript object. We've looked at a few of them already. We looked at new date. We looked at a little string object, and I think what we did also a number object. So, we kind of looked at that a little bit. So for the date object, we already looked at the toDate string and included the day, the month, the day of the week, the month, the year, all of that. Then you can get the full year, you can get the date, and you can get the month on that object, right? And like we said, that these, like here, the toDate string is a method that's associated with this date object, right? It's associated with this date object. So here's some properties and methods of the string object. So we're going to look at this a little more. So we got an index of. So an index of will get the location. Index of substring. Different ways to do this. So let's take a look at this. So we'll just do index of first. So here's index of. And so it's saying, what's the index of a space here? So you're going to count. So when you do this, you're going to start at 0, right? 0 is the capital G. 1 is the R. 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So this is index 5. You start 0 based on that. Start 0 based on that. It's pretty much straightforward. So you're using the string object to uppercase method, and you're calling it on the name that you have to make it all uppercase. We've already used the length, right? And so this one, yep, the name.length. So here actually, and well, just like both of these, just to kind of review, quick review here. Since this is a string literal, right? This is a string literal. This is a primitive, string primitive. This is not an object, right? But it is under the hood, like we said, it creates a temporary wrapper object, wrappers the name, so it wrappers this into a string object, and then it calls the to uppercase on that, right? And then it goes ahead and assigns that back to, it's going to assign that to the variable, and then it's going to just disregard, it's just going to get rid of that wrapper object that it used. And that's going to be the case. So then that would happen here, and then you go to the next line, it would do the same thing. It'd actually create a wrapper object for this to get the length, would reassign it to the name length, and then it's just going to discard of that wrapper object. Same thing as well for these other ones, right? So in all cases. So we've seen an index of 5. So here's substring. So what this is going to do is it's going to go from a 0 to the index. So it's going to basically be, it's not giving you the answer here. It's going to start at 0. So it's going to go for 5 spots though, right? It's going to start at 0. So it's going to be 1 spot, 2 spots, 3 spots, 4 spots, 5 spots. Okay. So it's just telling you where it starts. But the number here, the second number, is how many. You start counting at 0. You don't count this as 0. You count this to get the index. Okay. You start at 0, get the index. But once you have the index, which like in this case, this is 5, we're going to put the index here. We're going to start at 0, right? And we're going to count 5. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's just going to return grace here. So you need to spend a little time, make sure you understand that so you don't get confused with that, because you can sometimes get confused. When you're starting with, to get an index, right? You're starting with a 0, right? But then once you that's just for an index. But when you're doing a substring, you're going to count, right? 1. So spend a little time playing with that. It'll help you out. Okay, let's just see what we got here in our code here. All right. Where's our user object? Okay, here for this one, wasn't really paying attention here. So for this one here, so basically what this is an object, right? Whenever you use this open and close like this on curly braces, right? This is an object. And so this is, you're just passing this into this get user age. And this user, this is the name you're giving this function. We're getting ready to look at functions here, but I just kind of want to go through this object part of this. So you're passing that into here, and basically so this is the name that you're giving this, and then you're just saying, get me the age of the argument you passed in here. So it's basically going to get the age here, and it's going to return 25, right? Kind of key value, right? The key is age, the value is 25. So yeah, let's go and just look at the functions here. Let's see. Terms related to specific objects. I think we've covered pretty much of that, right? So here's a basic syntax for a function declaration. You use the keyword function. You give it a function name, and then you decide what parameters. This could be possibly no parameters, or it could have multiple. It could be one or many parameters. Okay. Could be one or many. So here's a function with no parameters, open and close parentheses. All right, so basically you're just doing some specific task, and then you're just leaving the function. All right, nothing's getting passed in. So basically you don't need the data. You don't need anything to be able to perform the task you want. Right. If there's something that you need, like you're passing, you would be passing something in from a different, passing it into the function if you need that data for that task you're trying to complete within the function. And this is basically how you would call that. You call it no parameters with no parameters, right? So what you define in here. Real quick, so these are the parameters, right? So in this other case, this is no parameters. But if you do have parameters, right, and you pass them in, whatever you passed in here, this is called an argument. So this is the difference between an argument and a parameter. A parameter is defined within your function, right? Within your parentheses of your function, that's the parameter. But the argument is what you pass to that function. This is an argument, okay? So here's a function declaration with one parameter that returns a DOM object, okay? So you can also define a method like this with this $sign, okay? And you're just passing in a selector, and then you're just returning something. Okay. How to call the function? You're calling the function by doing this, just using this $sign. I'm not a big fan of doing this. I think you just kind of cause some confusion, and I know it asks you in different places to do that, even assignments, but, I'd rather have a different name there, but that's okay. So this is basically, you're calling this function. This is the name of your function, $sign. You're passing in your selector. This is your argument, right? This is the argument to the function that you're calling. This is the parameter selector. So you're passing in your ID of email 1, and then it is just going to do a query selector on that and return that back here and assign that to your email variable here. Here's a function declaration with two parameters. And you're giving it a name here, a function called calculate text. So you've got two parameters, right? And so since you have two parameters, you're sending in you got two arguments. So in this case, for you to complete this task, you need something, right? You need something. And you need a subtotal, and you need a tax rate to be able to complete this task. And so you're passing in from somewhere else, right? So to call that function, you have to have the value to correctly complete this task, you have to have a subtotal and a tax rate so that you can send it in to call that function, right? And this is what's called, so we were looking at declarations, right? Function declaration, this is a declaration, this is another declaration. But there's also this idea of a function expression. When you're doing a function expression, you actually are assigning a variable, okay? You're assigning a variable to a function, okay? You're assigning a variable to a function. So here's a function expression with no parameters. So you basically just have an open and closed parentheses. You're performing the task and you're assigning that to show, okay? So the function, it's not what you're returning. It's basically the function. You are assigning the whole function to show year, right? And then so when to call that function, you just call show year, right? So sorry, I hope I didn't confuse you there for a minute. I was acting like you send back the result of this. No, this is actually you're assigning this whole function to this variable, right? So this whole function, this variable is the function, and this is how you call that, and that's called a function expression. So this is showing a function expression with one parameter, and you're back to using these dollar signs for the name of your function. So you do a const dollar sign equal with one parameter. And same thing, this is how you would call that. Here's a function expression with two parameters that returns a value. So in this case, you've got calculate tax. And so we call calculate tax down here. I think this is a little messed up, this thing here. Sure is. I don't know what happened on this. How to call the function. Subtotal, tax rate, call the function. So say sales tax equals, what happens is this is on this wrong line here. Not sure what happened on that, but so basically, yeah, so here you're calling calculate tax. So that's an expression. You have to pass it to arguments, right? So you're passing arguments, and you have defined parameters in your function, passing the arguments, and you're just setting that to this variable sales tax and printing this out, right? So here's an arrow function. And so different way to create a function. And so here you've got you're giving this a name. You're using an expression here, right? Function expression. Here's your parameters you're sending in. You don't have the function keyword like you did before. We're omitting the function keyword, right? So here's your parameters you're going to be using, right? And then it's an arrow function, so you've got an arrow here, right? It's always going to be an equal sign and the greater than sign for your arrow, right? And then here's the statements that are going to run when the function is executed. So calculate name. Here's code for a function expression. Yeah, just showing you different. So here was the function expression for calculate tax, where you've got your keyword function, you got your parameters. You know, you're performing your task and then returning the your tax stuff to fixed. Basically, you're doing this. You're returning the same stuff here. You're doing your calculation, returning it. But instead of having that function here, you don't have that function here, right? You just got rid of that function. There's some other benefits and other ways too, but you know, that's just in general. You don't have to have the. You can get rid of the whole function keyword when you use an arrow function. So yeah, so in this case, since you have just one parameter, you don't have to, you don't have any parameters listed. So here's for one parameter, do it like that, right? Sorry, I'm looking at something here. Subtotal. There's some stuff that's messed up here. Yeah, I think this one's a little messed up. So let's just kind of skip that. I don't want to confuse things. So basically, here's one parameter, right? And here's one without any parameter at all. You can just do it just like that, right? And basically, you call an arrow function just like you'd call any other function, right? In this case, since there's no parameters, open and close parentheses. If there is parameters, you have to include those. So let's look at a little bit of code here. So let's see here. So here's a functional declaration. It can be called before. Let me just bring that up higher. Make this big. So here can be called before they are defined due to hoisting. So basically what this is saying is, so you've got this function here that you created, right? And so even though you got this function and then you're calling this function, but you can actually call this, the idea of hoisting, and just make sure that this is there. So which one was this? This is 16 here. This is a function declaration. All right, that's right here, isn't it? Example function, yep. So this is number 16, which is right here. So this worked, even though we're calling this function, because this function is getting called right here, before we even define it, okay? And so what happens here on this is it basically uses that whole concept of hoisting. And what hoisting says, it moves it up the scope. Now, it's not like you see that in the file, but you just got to realize all this happens in memory. So in memory, it's kind of moving it up into the top part of the scope. So it actually moves it up before this is even getting called, right? But in the file, you're having it here, but in reality, in memory, it actually uses that concept of hoisting, and it's hoisting this, so this is at the top of the scope. Okay, when we're saying scope here, we're talking about the scope of this one is basically the whole file, right? This is a whole file scope, but you could have a method within a method and things like that. If you have a method within a method, or I'm sorry, a function within a function, if you have a function within a function, you can still call it before you define that function that's in the inside, right? It's going to move that to the top of the scope of that function, right? In this case, since this is basically a whole file, it's going to hoist that to the top of the file, not the file, but in memory, it's going to move that to the top, okay? All right, here's a function declaration with one parameter. We already seen that using the object, passing in an object. That's how you get a property from the object, doing dot on it. Here's an arrow function with one parameter. Same thing here, and you're just printing that out. Here's creating a function using an arrow function. Just a basic one here as well. Oh. So yeah, so here you're making this a lot shorter here. So for this, you can actually do it like this, where here's your parameter you're setting in. This is what you're basically returning from calling this. This is your return, is user.age, right? So you're doing this whole thing right here on one line, as opposed to if you did a normal type function, right? You would do it like this with an open and close, the curly braces, and then you would return like this. But you can actually, it's kind of a shortcut here. You can do this a one-liner for an arrow function. Here's your parameter, and here's what you're returning, user.age. And so when you call that get user age arrow here, it's going to return the age of, it's going to return 25, right? So it makes it a little more compact. Just shows an example of adding two numbers together, an x plus y. You just return x plus y. Now you guys remember, especially all you guys were in C#, you have to define your return type, right? Integer or double or whatever, or string, etc. But in JavaScript you don't do that like that, right? You just use the return keyword, and you return what you want to return. You don't define your type, right? In C# and those other languages, they're statically typed. You have to define the type. You have to tell the compiler, hey, I'm returning an integer, or I'm returning that. In JavaScript, you can just return whatever, right? You could return a string. You could even though you're maybe bringing in numbers, you could return a string. So your return type doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what parameters are defined, right? It's just whatever you decide for it to return. Let's see. Arrow function performs the same task as the add. So just like we looked at that other arrow function, we can go ahead and what we return is x plus y here, right? And this is just a one-liner, short and concise, just to do the x plus y. And so then we don't have to worry about the curly braces. Let's see what we got here. This is just showing a little more complicated. So you're not necessarily always going to get away with not having to worry about the curly braces. Sometimes it won't be as compact as you like. In this case, you got multiple things going on, right? So, not that you can. There's still there's still ways to do it to actually make this all in one line, but sometimes it gets a little too complex. Then it's not easy to understand, but it is still possible. All right. So here's something where you're passing in basically a selector. You're passing in a selector, and you're returning the query selector, right? You're returning the value of that, right? So what number is this here? Did I call that somewhere? Yeah, maybe I think I've multiple things. Let's see what I got here on this. So I just, over here in the console, I put in the $, and it's returning the selector, right? Didn't mean to do that. Let's see what else we have here. So terms related to functions. Let's see what I have in this other document. Terms related to functions. So just kind of review here. A function is a block of reusable code designed to perform a specific task. Functions allow you to organize your code, make it more readable, and avoid repeating code. So, that's kind of a litmus test, so to speak. If you're doing something, over and over again, over and over again, a lot of times that stuff can be, instead of copying code over and over again, it's something can be put in a function and then just calling the function. So to invoke a function, execute a function by its name, followed by the parentheses. This triggers the code within the function to run. For example, my function calls the function name my function. Okay, that's pretty much straightforward there. Function declaration, a way to define a function using the function keyword. Followed by the function name, parameters if any, and the function body within the curly braces. A parameter. So back to this again, just kind of want to mention this a few times just to get this in your head about a parameter and argument. A parameter, a variable listed inside the parentheses of a function declaration. Whatever's inside that function, parentheses of that function that you defined, them are the parameters. Parameters act as placeholders or values that will be passed into from the function when it is called. There's an example right there. We've already looked at, obviously. And the argument, the actual value that is passed into the function, is called the argument. Arguments correspond to the function's parameters. So you need to make sure that you're doing the correct order, because if you, let's say you're passing in the first, let's say the parameters, maybe the first, in a function, maybe the first parameter is a number and the second one's a string. They don't always necessarily have to be the same. Obviously, you're adding something together or whatever, but there may be other reasons that you're passing in more than just one data type. So maybe the first one's a number, the second one's a string. You need to make sure that you are passing in the right order. You could have 4 or 5 different parameters, and you need to make sure that the order 1, 2, 3, 4 of all 4 of them is correct on what you're passing in as how it's defined in the function. Passing parameters is a process of providing arguments to the function when it is called. And just like I said, arguments are assigned to the function parameters in the order they appear. A return statement within a function that specifies the value to be returned when the function finishes executing. The return statement also terminates the function's execution. So you could, within a function, you could have a bunch of logic going in there, and then if some certain condition happens, if x equals 5, and you could have a return on if x equals 5, and then you could, even if you have a bunch of logic after that, it's going to return and it's going to stop. It's going to stop executing anything, right? It'll stop executing and return. We just talked about hoisted. In JavaScript, function declarations are hoisted, meaning they are moved up to the top of their scope during the completion phase. This allows you to call a function before it's physically defined in the code. And once again, when we talk about hoisted, when we look at a static file, when we look at our JavaScript file, you're not going to see anything, right? It's all within the memory itself, right? Within the scope of that memory, within the browser, it is actually moved up in the scope so that you can actually call it before in the static file. You can actually call it before it's defined, but then in the scope, in the browser, in memory, it's going to be moved up to the top. Function expressions, a way to define a function by assigning it to a variable. So always remember, if you've seen a variable, then you know that's a function expression, right? If you have a variable with an equal sign and then you have the function after it, that's going to be a function expression. And we'll talk about later, not today, but we'll talk about later. There's some advantages to doing expressions as well, and we'll talk about that later. Arrow function is a concise syntax for writing functional expressions, introduced in ES6, which This is the version of JavaScript. So, it hasn't been around forever, within more recent versions of JavaScript. Arrow functions use the arrow operator. So make sure you always remember equal sign and then the greater than sign. Let's see, arrow operator, yeah. It separates the function's parameters from its body. So always remember the function parameters are going to be on the left side, right? The left side. Here you don't have a parameter, but we can do. So on the left side is going to be your parameters of your arrow function. On the right side is going to be your body, right? It's going to be on your body of your function. All right. So that kind of went through all of those. A function that uses variables and constants. All right, a function with two loops. So one thing I did kind of want to mention here. Displays 5. Oh. Yeah. Function scope. I is still in scope. Displays 5. J is not in scope. Reference error. Let's just go grab this. It's kind of hard to really see in that. Let's put that down here at the bottom. And then here's our thing here. Yeah, I think that this is kind of a little messed up on how they did this because yeah, it would pop up a thing. Oh, you got to call it though. That'd make a difference. So once again, since it's hoisting, we can call it even before it's defined, can't we? Okay, so that's 5. All right. So basically showing here block scope, function scope. So this one here is within this one here is within a function scope, okay, and so that will display 5. This one here is not in scope, and you'll get a reference error, and that is true. This is not, J is not defined. And here, let me just try something here. Yeah. Okay. I was wondering what they were. I was a little confused what's going on here. This is just all about variables, right? And so when you use a var, that's why we always say it's kind of better to use a let, right? This is outside. This is outside of this loop here, right? This is outside this loop. It's not like you define this variable before you did this for statement. But since you're using var, var is function scope, right? So this alert I can be called within this function. And since it's defined here as a var, this will be available at this point, even though you're outside of where this is kind of contained. But for a let is block scoped. So it would have to be within this parentheses, would have to be within these, not parentheses, these curly braces. This alert J would have to be within these curly braces for this to work because let has block scope. So this kind of difference between function scope and block scope. And that's function scope for the var keyword here. And so var has function scope and a let has block scope. So that's what's going on here. I mean, so we could actually move this. Let's see if this would even work here. It should work. Here, let me move that one down. So if I move that there, it's going to fail probably because of this is failing. Yeah. So even though, even it's all the way down here, right? It doesn't matter because this has function scope. We're within this function, right? And since this is defined as a var, that it's going to be accessible here, right? So it's kind of, I guess, a kind of a dangerous type thing because when you define a variable like this, your whole purpose is to define this within a function, right? That's kind of more of the reason for this. It's good. You're going to be using it within the function, right? So it kind of, and that's kind of one of the things I guess is kind of dangerous. Just can cause some side effects that you might not really want using the var keyword, and that's a perfect thing. Down here. So even this, let me try this. So I haven't done this before. I never kind of just playing around. This ain't something you would do. So even though, look at that, even put that within. Oh, well, it's going to do it 5 times because you're looping. So you put this alert I down here within this for loop. You don't have an I, but since you've got this I defined as a var, it has function scope, and you're still within this function, so it has access to this I within here, right? And I thought that was going to happen before I did this, but I wasn't 100% sure, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So I hope that kind of makes sense, and that's why they really kind of tell you it's a good idea to use the let keyword because it has block scope, and so it's not like most of the time you're not really wanting to have that variable outside of there, and especially if you're using single letters. Not that I don't do that on some of my examples and stuff, and programmers do it as well. But a lot of times you should use what's kind of relevant. Sometimes for loops it's okay, but usually if if it has some meaning besides that, you probably should give it a name. But a lot of times within loops, it's very customary to use variables like this. So, all right, let's go ahead and just delete this out of here. Had to kind of think through that as we're looking at that. Okay, so that's that. In terms of scope, All right, function scope, block scope, looked at that. Okay, talk about events a little bit here. So here's some common events. Window has a load event. Document has this DOM, content loaded. Basically meaning that the complete DOM content has been loaded. Basically that document has been loaded. Button has click event. It could be multiple. This is just some of the examples, right? So buttons, thing you use a lot with a button is generally a click event. Not that you can't do hover over and everything else or whatever. But usually for a button, it's click. It's all about clicking, right? So click event for a button, a control. So for like a text field, you could have focus, blur. So basically, blur is just moving off of it, right? Then you can have something like a change or select. Like so we've used, remember, like drop down list. We have select boxes. You can do some things where you click this and it's going to actually select something in a different box. You can do that as well. And it's just showing you different elements. Even just any element on a page can basically have a click event that, associated. A click, a double click, a mouse over, just mousing over something, mouse in, mouse out. So there's different events on different elements. So here we're doing syntax of an add event listener. So basically what you're doing here is you're adding an event listener to let's just say, for an example, a button. You're adding an event listener based on the click event. And when you do that, you have your code in there, but it only gets executed. It's kind of like you're registering the event, right? You're registering it, but it doesn't get executed until you click on the button, right? The event is, in this case, like for a button, it's a clicking, right? When you click, that's when the code gets executed. An event handler named join list. All right, I don't know what that's really telling me too much. Okay, sorry. I didn't really read through this. So this is basically doing here, what you're doing here is you're adding an event listener to the submit button. So you have a submit button, which is pound. So this is basically going to grab the ID of the field, right? And in this case is a button, I should say the field, the element. In this case, it's a submit button. So you're grabbing the submit button. You're grabbing a button that's of ID submit button, and you're adding an event listener to it. Okay, you're basically registering an event, and you're registering the click event, and you're saying when you click on this, run this method, join list, and this is the join list that alerts here, right? So how to attach an event listener to a double click event. Okay, so this is how you do a double click event. It has to be, make sure you do it, you have to, want to do upper cases. You want to make sure you got all lowercase letters. Same thing here. You have to have this isn't something you just make up on your own. Obviously, this method you're calling here, that's your own developer created method, right? Your developer created name, but here this is a specific event that you have to use, right? And then also you can actually remove an event listener. There might be some circumstances where you're sometimes you click something, and after you click it, you want it to disable it, and you may want to just remove the whole, or just remove the event that's associated with that, because you don't want them double clicking it multiple times, right? Maybe they click a button, you don't want them to be able to click that button again. Maybe that's something you only want to happen one time. So what you can do is they could click it. You can disable the button. That's one way, but maybe even a safer way is to unregister that event, so to speak, right? To remove that event listener. All right, so this is just showing how to use, so you got this method. You're making an arrow method, no parameters. Arrow function, I should say, no parameters, called show message. Right. And then you're just doing alert. And so then here you're going to do an event listener. And this is on a document, right? Document.add event listener. Before we're doing buttons, right? Button or another different element. In this case, we're doing it on the document itself. Document.add event listener. And we're using this. You have to make sure that you have this with, the correct upper and lowercase letters, DOM content loaded. And then, so when after that has happened, after the content's been loaded, it's going to go ahead and execute the show message function, which is defined up here. Using an anonymous function as the event handler. Okay. Okay, so here you're actually kind of doing this all in one instead of, this is where you kind of really start saving some time and for coding and make it more concise. Is instead of having your function defined like this, and then also having, so all of this code together here, right, can be done in just this one what's called an anonymous function, right? An anonymous function is you're not declaring it like here. You're declaring a variable and all this. You can this makes this an anonymous an anonymous function, and so you can actually, so here you've got your your event, and then you go ahead and this is your anonymous function that you're just telling it to execute this. So this will add this to event listener, and so this code will not get executed until until the document, the DOM has been loaded, right? The document's been loaded. Code that attaches a click event handler. Okay. Okay, yeah. Maybe you want to do that. I don't know. But so here it's just showing you once the DOM is loaded, go ahead and then go ahead and grab your calculate field. I should say calculate element by ID, right? You're grabbing your calculate element by ID and you're adding an event listener that's an on click, and then when you that's a click event, and then when that is, and then you're gonna be calling this method, right? So like I said, once you define this, it's not gonna nothing's gonna happen, right? You're gonna define this. You're basically registering this event, and then what happens is this code gets run. This code's going to get run, it's going to get run right after you load your document. Then it's going to do this part, right? It's going to do this part after it's loaded. It's going to do this part, which is just adding your event listener, right? This function's not going to be called until you click on the button, right? In this case, whatever, I shouldn't calculate the button. So once you click your button, right? So it doesn't define this, right? It doesn't really it doesn't add this listener until this document's been loaded. Once the document's loaded, it adds the listener, right? Which actually, includes this. But then it doesn't actually call this process entries until you click the button, right? Hope that makes sense. Using an anonymous function as an event handler. Okay. All right. Yeah, so this is just showing you, instead of having this separate here, right? Instead of having this separate here, whatever code you have here, right, you would just have here instead, right? So that you're kind of creating it all in one scope here, right, in one area. All right. Property method event, current target, prevent default. Okay. Let's say I have my code here on any of this. All right. So just similar to what we're looking for, same thing here. We're doing an add event listener. Once the DOM content's loaded. So once that DOM's loaded, then we are going to ship button. We're adding the event listener on click event, right? Now prevent default. So what prevent default will do, especially like using them on forms and stuff. If you got a form, you don't really want it to do anything, right? Sometimes you don't want it to actually like execute a form. You can do like prevent default, and this will prevent it from executing. We'll look at that again later on. But so let's just kind of look at this real quick. So we got an on-click event. What's this going to do? 4.4, welcome to the calculate homepage. Okay. So if I click on, so I did a mouse over there, didn't I? There we go. That's what happened there. So I'm going to click on this ship button. And as soon as I clicked on that ship button, you notice that I put this in the console down here, right? You know, and this is very helpful when you're debugging stuff and trying to figure out things that are wrong, just to be able to log things. So I'm logging a current target.value, and the current target.value is ship it, right? So if we went and looked at our HTML for the ship, let's go look, ship value ship it, right? So that's what's happening here. So we registered that click event. We added that event listener for click. And then when we do a current target.value, this is going to actually get the value of that field for this, whatever the value of this field is, right? And in this case, it was ship it, right? And then here, we're doing a mouse over. And so this is grabbing username, and we're adding, we add event measure, mouse over. So that when we do a mouse over, it's going to go ahead and log that, which kind of been doing this a couple of times every time I kind of go over here. So every time if you kind of see down here, it says 5. Since you keep on doing it, this way the console will work. It'll just keep adding this number, right? Because you're doing the same thing over and over again. Now it's up to 8, 9, 10, right? It's just going to keep on adding to that. So that's kind of how that works in the console. So that's how you do a mouse over, right? An on-click event. All right. So it's basically saying there's actions kind of associated with certain HTML elements. So in this case, like, you know, basically when you click a link, right, you don't have to necessarily do an on-click event, right? When you click a link, an event actually takes place by default, right? It's gonna load a page or image, right, based on the href, right? Input submits the form if the type attribute is set to submit. So if you've got, so if you have if the type attribute set to submit, okay, a reset the form if the type attribute is set to reset. Oh, okay, because sometimes you can do buttons in different ways. You can do input type, right? Your input type can be button, or you can use the button tags, or you can use the input tags. Input tag equals button, and if your input tag button equals submit, then basically by default it's going to create an event and it's going to submit the form, right? If you define your input field as a reset, you click on that, right? It's going to reset the form. So them are some actions that take place without you like doing an on click, you know, doing those click events, right? Using those event listeners. By default, they have those actions. And that's one thing, like we had that one method there, that one function, prevent default. So the prevent default, if let's say you had a submit function that submits the form, you click it, it's going to submit the form, right? When we did the form stuff, you know that when you click that button, submit the form, even though it failed because, you know, we don't really have a server back end, and it, you know, we were looking at that, but it will actually submit that form. But you can prevent that from being submitted by doing this event, EVT for event, prevent default, and this will stop that from submitting. And there's cases you want to do that because you might have you might do on click event of your submit button, you might do some logic. You might want to check some fields. You might want to do some different things. And then if something fails, some validation. You might do some validation. And if that validation fails, you don't want to submit that form. So that what you could do is if a validation fails, you can do event.prevent default so that it doesn't get submitted so that the user can go ahead and correct that, okay? Now, also with the form elements, in later versions of JavaScript, and like what we've been using in this class, because we're definitely using a later version of JavaScript. There's that built-in functionality where it makes things required. So it actually behind the scenes, it's actually doing this itself. When you've got a field that you marked as required, and it doesn't, it won't execute. It's not going to execute on that submit button until you have all those required fields. So by default, behind the scenes, it's actually calling a prevent default itself. Okay. Let's see here. And let's just show an example. This is how you prevent the form from being submitted. Use the prevent default. All right. All right, just showing an example here of the All right, I think I'm just going to go ahead and we'll look at the remaining. Okay, so regarding the assignments, pretty straightforward here. There's really not much to really go over here. So chapter 4 homework is basically doing the free code camp thing, just doing a little bit more. I think we're at 40% now after the chapter 2 and 3 assignments. So here for chapter 4, we're doing up to 60%. Now this lab here, so basically you use your Muroc book, right? Found on pages 157, 158. So let me just bring that up. Is it the right one? So what was that saying? Page 157, 158. So in this exercise, you'll enhance the validation for the MPG application. So one thing I did want to mention, I did send an email. Was it late last week? Was it Saturday? I don't know. I think it's Friday. So, because I noticed, I don't know if everyone downloaded their exercises, because you can actually, if you kind of go here on the left hand, downloadable files for this book. I'm not sure that everybody downloaded those. Maybe some have, but there's student files, and so some of these exercises refer to that. So basically, what I did do though is I pushed to everybody's repository, including I have a copy of my own that's the same as yours. So in here under JavaScript, I went ahead and no, I didn't do my own. That's all right. I did push them to my own. Let me pull up one here. So in your repository, I went ahead and for everybody's repository, I went ahead and added a folder, a JavaScript folder for some of the exercises. So if you didn't use the download, if you didn't download the student files that are available through Muroc, then for the chapter 4s and 5, you can go ahead and use this directory here and get them out of there. So for that, so in GitHub Desktop, basically you're going to want to go ahead and click the fetch button up there at the top, so you can fetch files. Most of the time, you rarely probably would need to do that in most cases, because you're the ones always checking in the code and you're not really fetching something that was checked in by somebody else. But I push that to everybody's repository. So if you want those extras, if you want this folder that has the exercises in it, you need to go ahead and click fetch at the top of GitHub Desktop. And so this will have the different ones. And for this chapter 4, here's the miles per gallon and here's the future value ones. Okay. So besides that, I think this is pretty much straightforward. There's really not much of anything to go over here, I don't think. Let me see what's on the next page. Okay. So, please make sure, let's go back here. So please make sure you complete this completely, right? This is more than just grabbing the thing. You need to make the updates, right? You need to make the updates to that. So 157 is where this is started, right? Then you make sure you do on what's on page 58. You need to do this enhanced data validation, right? And the same thing with the future value app. So this one here is not really in the book. You're just going to create this from scratch. You implement the user interface as shown above, but use the output fields. Remember, that's what we kind of did on that very first homework, chapter 2 homework assignment. We used the output field. It's a request you to use the output field for the sales tax and the totals. And like I said, when we did that, we kind of had text in there too, usually in output fields for a calculation. And in this case, this is really the more appropriate way to use the output field, because this is what you're doing, is you're just using a calculation, right? So this is pretty straightforward, I think. I'm sure it's going to take a little bit of work, but I think it's pretty straightforward as far as from an explanation standpoint. And then after that, you got a change calculator. And then you have an income tax calculator. So make sure that you scroll down. There's 5 exercises in total on that. So I guess that's about all I have. Let me know if you have any questions about anything.